Well, I was a writer, I guess you could say, ever since I was about 12 or 13 years old. In fact, probably even younger than that. Before I even became a writer, before I even knew how to read and write, I did a book. I drew pictures of dinosaurs and copied the names as best I could, not knowing what the letters were. And I did this when I was about 5 years old, before I had actually gone to school. So there was a writing instinct in me from a long ways back. When I was a teenager, I tried to crack the sci-fi magazines at the time, had no success. I wrote for a high school musical, a musical review that was done in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1972 called X. And of all the segments in it, my two segments were the ones that got people the most upset and threatened to have the project pulled and things like this. But I was drafted at that time into the Army. The Vietnam War was winding down, but the draft was still on. So I became a military journalist. And I spent the next 6 years working in public affairs for the Army. During that time, I continued writing short stories, continued trying to sell them, didn't sell them. When I got out of the Army, I had applied to UC's film school and had been accepted, but that wasn't starting until October. I had gotten out in February. So I came to California and figured I'll get my feet wet, working in a studio as a driver, the mailroom, something like that. I started at the top and I was working my way down. I got all the way down to Filmation Studios, and I literally walked in the door 5 minutes after Lou Scheimer said, "We need to find another staff writer and fast." When they found out I had been writing short stories and editing Army newspapers and things like that, they asked me, "Would you like to try writing a animation script?" And I said, "Sure," and here I am. That was 78, I believe. From Filmation, I went to Ruby Spears Studios. Ruby Spears are the people who did Thundar the Barbarian and a host of other shows. I met Steve Gerber at Ruby Spears, met Jack Kirby, met Flint Dilley there as well. Quite a few of the people that I ended up working with on Transformers I met there. Steve left Ruby Spears a short while before I did, and he ended up getting the story editor gig on G.I. Joe, and he asked me if I'd be interested in doing it. And at the time I was getting a little bit frustrated by the what I considered picayune network restrictions and whatnot on animation. If you've ever seen 70s animation and early 80s animation that the networks approved compared to the animation that they have now, or compared to what was done in syndication in the late 80s, it was very tame stuff. So I jumped at the chance to write an episode of G.I. Joe, and at the same time they were doing G.I. Joe, Transformers was ongoing, so I ended up becoming more or less a staff writer and then an assistant story editor for G.I. Joe, but would step in and pinch hit and write stories for Transformers at the same time. We had at one time three 52 episode series going simultaneously, plus two 13-episode weekend series. We were doing all of this at one time. I mean, it was very, very intense and very hectic. Well, we were part of Sunbow West, and here the geography gets complicated because you had Sunbow East, which was part of Griffin McCall. That was in New York. Sunbow West was a small suite of offices in Westwood, and then at the time we were also working with Marvel Productions, and Marvel Productions had their own production facility in, I believe it was in the San Fernando Valley at that time. They may have moved it before or after that, I can't remember. We had the nicest offices. We were down in Westwood. We were just south of UCLA. It was the summertime. It was nice and pleasant. Just really, really nice working environment. I have never been in a nicer working environment, both in the terms of the people I was working with and the actual physical location. But there was a lot of work that had to be done. We had people coming in, freelancers, pitching stories, dropping stories off, taking revisions back. We were one of the first offices to become fully integrated on the internet because we just couldn't afford the time. It wasn't the money. It was we couldn't afford the time to either mail or FedEx stuff back and forth to one another. We had to get all hooked up on the internet before anybody else got hooked up on it, just so we could exchange the scripts back and forth faster. It was an intense period. The joke was that at 1 o'clock in the morning, you could always be certain that one of the staff, the entire staff was up and working at home on scripts that they were going to be bringing in the next day. So very little sleep, but a lot of fun. Hasbro was not as intensely involved as you might think. At first, they are very nervous about the project. They give you, the Bible that's been developed, and they suggest, characters and vehicles and whatnot. But once they realized that we knew what we were doing and that we were turning in good and interesting stories, they would let us generate as much of the material as we possibly could. Every now and then they'd say, hey, we haven't seen Bumblebee for a while, do an episode with him, or we're gonna introduce a new character, make sure he gets mentioned at this point, things like that. But they generally just tended to give us our head and let us go wherever we wanted to. I mean, they approved some things that I was surprised, because networks would have just rolled their eyes back in horror and refused to do anything like that. But they let us tackle some pretty deep themes and emotional ideas and whatnot. The God Gambit, which I wrote for Transformers, you couldn't even mention religion, much less engage in a debate between atheism and any kind of theology. And the God Gambit is a story in Transformers where some of the Decepticons pretend to be gods to a race of aliens in order to get the aliens to do their bidding. And you end up, the story, it's action-packed, but it's also got this theological debate going on in it. How do you know you are following the correct path? How do you even know that a God exists? And the networks wouldn't even let us put crosses in graveyards. If you were doing Scooby-Doo, you couldn't have a cross in the graveyard, because they were afraid that it would either offend the Christians or it would offend the non-Christians. I mean, that's how silly it became. The networks were also, wanting action, but they didn't want violence. I mean, one of the silliest examples, this series was never made, but at Ruby Spears, Jack Kirby, Steve Gerber, myself, and a bunch of others were working on a thing called Roxy's Raiders, which, as you might guess, was a Raiders of the Lost Ark ripoff. And in the pilot episode, which never got filmed but was storyboarded, Roxy is tied to a post in a cave that's flooding, and the bad guy releases a poisonous snake. And the network's note was, don't have him release the snake where the snake can see Roxy. You have to have a rock between the snake and Roxy, so the snake swims around the rock and then sees her. Because if he releases the snake and the snake sees Roxy, it's murder. But if he releases the snake and the snake doesn't see it, then the snake just happens to attack Roxy. And it's like, come on, this is the most ridiculous, nitpicking, parsing of morality and ethics I'd ever heard of in my life. And it was things like this that got us very frustrated at Ruby Spears. We were doing Thundar the Barbarian, which, as you may guess, was not a warm and fuzzy show. And they kept pulling us back, and Transformers and G.I. Joe were a welcome relief to the restrictions that have been put on us at the network. Prime Target is a great example of a character in search of a story. I had come up with a character for a comic book called Baron Stegar, and the comic book project did not come about, and I just thought, wow, cool character, where could I use him? So I figured, well, let's work him into the Transformers, because we couldn't work him into G.I. Joe because we had like 80-some characters in G.I. Joe. So I figured we can work a human villain into Transformers. What would a human villain do to the Transformers? And I thought, well, he's a baron, he's kind of arrogant and whatnot. Let's make him a big game hunter. Let's have him going after the biggest game of all. And yes, I'm acutely aware of the most dangerous game and whatnot. And I figured, well, let's take a page from that and use the Most Dangerous Game as kind of a template and set up a story where, Baron Stegar lures the Transformers and the Decepticons out so that he can hunt them, so that he can have this claim of having, destroyed, one of the Transformers. So that was pretty much the origin of that. That was a pretty fun story, as I remember. It was not particularly deep or emotionally complex, but it was a lot of fun to write. The year before Transformers came out, in fact, the year that I left Ruby Spears had done a show called Turbo Teen, which was about a teenage boy who magically turns into a car. And I remember when they did this, I had become aware of the Transformers toys. I had no idea they were actually planning a series at that time. And I just could not believe, I said, why are you doing something stupid like a boy who turns into a car? You've got these cool toys from Japan. Why aren't we doing stories about, robots that turn into vehicles and whatnot? It makes more sense. Nobody will identify with the robots, so fine. When Transformers came along, I was more than happy to work on it. But it was difficult trying to come up with unique challenges and problems and situations to put them into. In a certain aspect, you were limited because there's only so many things you can do to a particular type of vehicle. On the other aspect, you were pretty much unlimited because there weren't a lot of areas that we couldn't explore with the Transformers. We could do just about anything we wanted to with that series. Transformers was a successful show for two reasons. Number one, it was cool. You can't separate the Transformers themselves from the success of the show, because there were imitations that came out that at the time did pretty well too. And they did well because the idea of robots transforming into vehicles and back again, it's just a cool idea. I mean, the Japanese are still doing it. It also worked because the crew that we brought together to do the writing and the art design and the storyboarding and whatnot, these were people who really wanted to tell good stories. We did not talk down to our audience. We wrote for ourselves. We wrote, what's the kind of story I would be interested in seeing on this show? And we realized there were certain limitations. There were certain boundaries that, were out there. But within those boundaries, there was a lot we could do. And we figured, well, since the network is this tiny little thing and syndication is this big thing, let's take advantage of that and explore as much of this territory as we can. It gave us freedom to do different types of stories, interesting stories. Having as many characters as we had let us have villainous characters who had, some slightly virtuous aspects to them, heroic characters who had some rough aspects to them. In other words, complex characters and complex stories could be worked out with it. No slam on the people who did Scooby-Doo, but you never worry about the moral character of Thelma and Shaggy and whatnot. They're always going to do the right thing. There will never be a conflict or something that will tear at their hearts and try to make them decide one thing or the other. With the Transformers, with G.I. Joe, with Inhumanoids, with all the shows that we did, even My Little Pony, believe it or not, we had such a wide and rich variety of characters that we could tackle just about any kind of story we wanted to do. And great voices. I got to add that too. We had an absolutely astonishing cast on every show we had, and I can't praise the actors or Wally Burr, who was the voice director, highly enough, because Wally is one of the few voice directors who actually bothered to read the script and figure out what it was all about before assigning roles and before trying to direct it. Too many voice directors at that time would just march them in, have them say the lines, and march them out, and they wouldn't even know what they were saying. They would read typos. They wouldn't, they'd read obvious misprints and whatnot because the voice directors just didn't care. The story editing staff ended up doing a lot more work on the show than just story editing. We frequently would go to the mix sessions and make sure that the sound effects were properly balanced and in the right place and whatnot. We always had somebody at a recording session, because in the event in the event a line played badly or a scene played badly, we wanted to have somebody there who could fix it in a hurry. We were one of the few animated shows that would actually get in the recording studio and hear a line and say, okay, no, that's too clunky, that sounds too dumb, let's fix it, and we would change it. Virtually every other studio, once the script was approved, it was locked in and there was no changing of it. This was mostly for technical reasons, because they wanted to get the animation done, and they had to have the script locked down before they could do the animation. But we just felt, you know, it's better to have it sound good than to, you know, be trapped with a bad reading. So we did a lot of that. We went into a lot of those sessions. I mean, virtually every session we were in, and we were there. We'd sometimes explain when we would have actors coming in who weren't regulars or who were playing, you know, characters who were supporting characters for that particular episode. The writers and the editors could then explain, well, your character is this, he does this sort of thing. We would also try to take in storyboards, because a lot of times, you know, if an actor understood, oh, I'm supposed to be outdoors when I'm saying this, he would deliver the line in a subtly different way than he would if he were talking indoors. One of the things that made TV animation in the 70s so bad was that everything was read at the same level pretty much, and nobody made a real effort to voice act. They just read the lines. I'm very satisfied and proud of the work we did on Transformers, G.I. Joe, Inhumanoids, and whatnot, because we broke the mold of the old network animation that had been done up to that point. We had storylines that were not normally done on network animation. We had characters who were more rough-edged and more multifaceted than the networks would permit. We were able to tackle stories that the networks didn't want to do. Saying that, I also look around now at some of the stuff that's on, and some of the things I see, I am so envious of the people who get to work on them, because they are so far ahead of what we were doing, and I really wish I could work on some of those programs. After G.I. Joe and whatnot, I've done a variety of things. I worked on Batman, for instance, and Batman was another step in the evolution of animation, but it's going even further. And I really, both in America and overseas, I'm really astonished and pleased by the best animation that's coming out. A lot of stuff out there is crap, but then a lot of stuff is always crap. The best stuff seems to be getting better and better. And I'd like to think that it was in no small part because we were able to show you could tell complex stories, you could tell more thematically deep stories than the networks permitted, and find an audience for it. So I'm very happy with what we did, and I'm very envious of the people who are out there now. Technical terms, I think the quality of the animation is better now, and it's better for a wide variety of reasons, not the least of which is computers make things a lot smoother and a lot easier. That being said, we were better than anybody else at the time, and I'm very happy with that too.